The diner was half empty, the rain pounding against the windows like a warning. Margaret Evans, in her worn apron and cracked shoes, asked the sharply dressed stranger if he wanted a table for one. But instead of answering, he stared at her like he'd seen a ghost, his lips trembling, his voice barely above a whisper as he said, "Mom?" Her hand slipped. A porcelain cup shattered on the tile, and every eye in the room turned toward a truth too heavy to carry out loud. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The rain that Tuesday morning came down like it had a purpose. Not a soft drizzle, not a cleansing spring rain, but a curtain of water, heavy and unrelenting, drumming against the diner's windows with the rhythm of old regrets. Margaret Evans stood behind the counter, wiping down the same laminate surface she'd wiped 1,000 times before. Her motions were methodical, practiced, unconscious. The same could be said for her life. Reliable, quiet, built on repetition. She took comfort in the familiar. The hiss of bacon on the griddle, the clink of coffee cups in the sink, the soft hum of the jukebox stuck on a song from '92. Margaret didn't mind the routine. It kept the silence from asking too many questions. 30 years at Dale's Diner hadn't made her rich, but it had made her invisible in the way that only long, honest work can. She was the background of other people's lives, the woman who remembered your order and asked how your father's surgery went. She existed in the margins, unnoticed but indispensable. The regulars relied on her presence the way they relied on the salt shaker not being sticky or the coffee being hot. She was part of the architecture of the place. But behind that quiet demeanor was a woman who had buried more than memories. There was a time when Margaret Evans had plans. Love, college, a future. But when her baby came and the man who gave her that child vanished like a vapor trail, she made a choice. Not for glory, not even for dignity, but for survival. One job turned into two, two into three, until the edges of who she once was frayed into something more functional than emotional. Dale's Diner wasn't supposed to be permanent. It was supposed to be a stopgap, but somehow the stop became the whole journey. Her co-workers had long stopped asking about her past, not because they didn't wonder, but because Margaret had a way of ending conversations with a glance. She had no pictures at her station, no social media accounts, no holidays off, just work. And yet there was something noble in it, something pure, like a monk in a secular temple of chrome stools and cracked menus. Her silence wasn't empty. It was armor. So when the bell above the door jingled and a man stepped in with rain in his hair and shock in his eyes, Margaret looked up only briefly. Just another customer. Probably wanted eggs over medium. She reached for her pad, rehearsing the line without thinking, but the way he looked at her wasn't casual. It was searching, unsteady. And then, like a thread pulled from a long-forgotten seam, her name unraveled in a single word. "Mom?" he said. The pen slipped from her fingers and rolled across the counter. Margaret's knees buckled slightly as the cup shattered at her feet, its shards scattering like echoes of a memory long exiled. For a second, the clatter drowned out the diner, the sizzle from the kitchen, the low murmur of patrons, the rhythmic clink of forks against plates. Everything halted, suspended in the space between recognition and denial. The man before her, no longer just a sharply dressed stranger but a living, breathing reckoning, held out the photograph like it was proof of something holy. His hands were steady in theory, but Margaret noticed the slightest tremor, a trembling not of nerves, but of weight, of a truth long carried, finally delivered. She didn't have to look at the picture to know what it was. She had burned the original years ago in a moment of weakness, trying to cauterize the wound left behind. But the image was etched into her mind. Her 21-year-old self, eyes hollow from labor and fear, cradling a newborn wrapped in a hospital-issued blanket. A moment stolen from joy, swallowed by inevitability. I gave you up when you were 5, she managed, her voice a rasp pulled from the depths of decades-old grief. It was a closed adoption. No names, no trail. She had whispered those words to herself countless times through sleepless nights, as if saying them enough would make them feel less like abandonment and more like strategy. But now, facing the man her baby had become, the words felt like glass in her mouth. Daniel didn't flinch. His eyes, so like hers it hurt to look at them, remained locked on her. I found you anyway, he said, not with accusation, but quiet insistence. DNA test, private investigator. I needed to know where I came from. His voice carried no malice, just an ache that had gone unanswered too long. He hadn't come to expose her. He had come to understand himself. That was the hardest part. Margaret's breath caught. Her hand reached for the edge of the counter, not for support, but to ground herself, to stop from slipping into the past entirely. I left because I had to, she said at last. Your father, wasn't just cruel. He was dangerous. I thought keeping you meant condemning you to a life of fear. So I chose to disappear. I chose silence over safety. I hated myself for it every single day. Daniel looked down, swallowed hard, then lifted his gaze again, softer now. You gave me a better life, and I needed to look you in the eyes to say, I don't hate you for that. In that moment, the decades between them didn't disappear. They remained, tall and jagged like a mountain range. But for the first time, mother and son stood on the same side of it. The story spread like wildfire, ignited by a single headline and fanned by the insatiable hunger of the modern world's favorite sport, public judgment. Daniel Crane reunites with biological mother working in local diner. It was a headline too rich to resist, tailor-made for 1,000 versions of truth, none of them Margaret's. By the next morning, Dale's diner was no longer a sleepy roadside stop. It was a circus. Paparazzi loitered outside, snapping shots through rain-streaked windows as Margaret poured coffee for truckers and retirees. Her hands, once steady from years of muscle memory, now trembled under the scrutiny of zoom lenses. Every move she made, how she folded a napkin, how long she stayed in the break room, whether she smiled or frowned, was dissected in tabloids and Twitter threads by people who had never known her name until yesterday. The whispers started small, but in a place like Miller Creek, even whispers echoed. Her coworkers, people who had laughed with her over burnt toast and shared Christmas Eve shifts, began to shift their tone. Jokes about cashing out became loaded with envy. Some eyed her like a lottery ticket waiting to be scratched. Others muttered about betrayal, about secrets too big to sit quietly among ketchup bottles and coffee stains. The trust that had cocooned her for decades now felt thin, punctured by the ugly curiosity of strangers. And still, Margaret said nothing. She wiped counters, cleared plates, smiled with a tired grace that made her seem more statue than woman. But inside her, something buckled. Not under the weight of guilt. She had long made peace with her decision, but under the crushing realization that her truth had been hijacked, twisted into someone else's morality tale. Then came Daniel's offer, the one she feared and expected in equal measure. I want to buy you a house, he said. Set you up for life. You don't need to work another day. The kindness in his eyes only made it worse. Her voice cracked like a fault line. I'm not ashamed of where I come from, Daniel. I'm ashamed of leaving you, but I won't run away from this life now. She saw it in him then, the dissonance. He hadn't expected resistance. To him, wealth was salvation. To her, it was a foreign language. It's not running, he said coldly. It's fixing what's broken. That stung deeper than the headlines. Because what Daniel didn't understand, couldn't yet understand, was that Margaret had already paid the price. With her silence, with her son. And no amount of money could rewrite the ledger of her soul. So when the silence between them stretched into 3 weeks, it wasn't born of anger. It was mourning. His, for the mother he thought he was saving. Hers for the son who didn't yet see the woman she had become. The gala had ended hours ago, but the weight of it still hung in the air like the lingering scent of expensive cologne and hollow applause. Margaret stood near the side entrance of the event hall, her waitress uniform soaked at the collar where the night's humidity clung. She had stood in a room full of millionaires dressed in glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos, and for the first time in years, she had not shrunk. She had declared her truth, not for sympathy, not for spectacle, but for reclamation. Daniel found her beneath the yellow wash of a flickering security light, hands stuffed in the pockets of his suit pants, expression caught between shame and something softer. "You embarrassed me," he said, barely above a whisper, but it wasn't the words that landed, it was the catch in his throat. His eyes betrayed him, glossed with emotion that hadn't been scripted into any public speech. Margaret didn't flinch. "You needed to see me for who I am, not who you imagined, not who the press invented, just me." For a long second, the silence stretched. Then, slowly, Daniel's shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but in surrender. "I didn't want to fix you," he said. "I wanted to know you." There it was, the truth he hadn't known how to say before. Not pity, not guilt, just yearning. They were strangers tied by blood and history, standing in the quiet aftermath of an almost life that could have been. They didn't speak as they walked, side by side down the dim street, past shuttered shops and street lamps buzzing like lazy wasps. Margaret's shoes scuffed the sidewalk. Daniel's pace slowed to match hers. And when he finally reached out, slipping his arm around her shoulders, she didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just exhaled, long and low, like a weight she'd carried for 3 decades had finally been laid to rest. Weeks later, the world had moved on to other headlines. But in Dale's diner, a new item appeared on the laminated menu. Mom's Special, 2 eggs, crispy bacon, sourdough toast, and coffee with just the right amount of cream. Regulars knew it wasn't about the food. Daniel came in every Sunday, always alone. No bodyguards, no headlines. He took the booth by the window, the one with a view of the street and the past he now understood. Margaret would pour his coffee with a knowing glance, no words needed. They talked. Sometimes about childhoods that never were, sometimes about the weather, but always as mother and son, not to rewrite history, but to finally start living it, together.